Here we go. I'm gonna have all the accessories today. There we go. Targaryen Day. Hey guys, it's me, Apples and Dragons. This is Grey Sheep and Hedge Wizards, the show where I talk about A Song of Ice and Fire, like a lunatic. And today, the topic is gonna be Daenerys Targaryen. Sort of. More specifically, her baby, Rhaego Targaryen. Well, it's going to include a lot of things. It's going to include Mirri Duur and her prophecy, and Khal Drogo a little bit. Anyway, intro stuff. Let's see. If you have not read all of the A Song of Ice and Fire books by George R. R. Martin, go away. The first book looks like this. The glass candle is lit because it represents return of magic to the world. And that is what it represents in the story. The Citadel of Old Town. Anyway, let's get to it. This is going to be sloppy because I didn't plan anything, but I think you'll like it anyway. I haven't done an episode in a while because the one I want to do requires me to do a lot of work that I've been putting off about the world of Ice and Fire. So for now, I'm just going to do this improv episode of Daenerys Targaryen here, or Rhaego Targaryen. I think that's everything taken care of. Let's jump right in. What chapter was it? Daenerys 9, I think. 600, page 628. Let's check that one. It's the one about Rhaego. Rhaego's born. Yeah. Wings shadowed her fever dream. You don't want to wake the dragon, do you? Holy moly. This is like the biggest dream in the books, I think. Except for Brand 3. The whole chapter is a dream. Yeah. She woke to the taste of ashes. Sleep, princess, Ser Jorah said. The women say, he never lived, my princess. There it is. That's what I'm looking for. So in this chapter, Dany is about to give birth. Well, it starts out with a giant dream. But ignoring the dream for now. Dany's in Mirri Duur's tent. Mirri has finished the ritual to save Khal Drogo's life. And Dany's waking up to find out that she gave birth while she was asleep. That her son is dead, was born dead. And he was hideously deformed, and they buried him already. And Khal Drogo is alive, but he's basically in a coma. There's no life in him, he can't do anything. He just kind of stares blankly into space. In this episode, I'm going to tell you my theory about Rhaego Targaryen. Which is not really a theory, it's more of an analysis. And I've given some thought to the difference between a theory and analysis. So I want to talk about that first a little bit. I think there are a lot of differences between a theory and an analysis. But I think some of them are that a theory tries to entertain and predict. Tries to entertain its audience and predict the future of the story. I think analysis tries to understand and, maybe just understand. It doesn't necessarily try to predict anything. When I analyze the story, fundamentally what I'm doing, is I'm just trying to figure out what the story's philosophies are. Because every story has philosophies at work. And then insofar as those philosophies are useful for predicting the future of the story, the things I learn analyzing the story can suggest predictions about the future of the story. Because once I know what the philosophies are, there's no question that they're going to continue through the future of the story. The only questions left are the specifics of how it's going to do that. For example, one philosophy in play in A Song of Ice and Fire is this idea of the true seeing, where Syrio Forel teaches Arya how to see things truly. But Syrio Forel isn't the only character who teaches someone or expresses a philosophy of how to see things truly. The same idea is expressed and portrayed whenever characters talk about the idea of a true knight. The question of whether or not a knight who breaks knightly vows is still really a knight. Likewise, I think analysis can be entertaining, but it doesn't necessarily aim to be entertaining. It aims to inform. So that's why I like doing these videos better than the ones that involve a lot of artwork and production value and all that. I like those ones too, because they force me to condense and simplify things, which helps me understand things more deeply. But I think the proportions of how much work they require on my part and how much substance they convey is inefficient. The trade-off is that it's a longer watch time on your end. But anyway, to continue the example, when I come across a mystery in the story, I can try to apply that philosophy to it and say, okay, how does the behavior of this person, place, thing, or idea compare and contrast with its seeming? What it says it is, what other people says it is, what other people says it's doing, what it's advertised to do, just all these sorts of things that are important to know, but can be misleading, have little or nothing to do with what the thing is actually doing, the effects that it's causing in the world and for people. Throughout the A Song of Ice and Fire audience, you'll notice that there's a portion of readers who are kind of annoyed that other readers often treat the story like a word puzzle game or something like that. So I'm going to show you some examples of readers like that. This thread is called Typos in A Dance with Dragons chapter. Are they just mistakes or do they have hidden meanings? Tinfoil. And one example he gives is the typo Mummer's face. In A Dance with Dragons Tyrion 9, the phrase Mummer's face is used when it should have been Mummer's farce. And he's wondering if maybe the author did this on purpose as part of like a word game or puzzle game or something, part of a mystery. And in this case, it turns out to just be a typo. There are other people with different copies of the books, different versions, that don't have the typo. So this is an example of a time when the reader is punished for reading too much into the story, into the specific word choices and sentence structure and all of that. And this commenter says, when in doubt, assume error. Contrary to what fans like to think, George R.R. Martin absolutely doesn't litter these books with secret clues disguised as inconsistencies. And it's a funny comment to me because it's exactly, it's perfectly wrong in every way. It's the exact opposite is true. George R. R. Martin does litter these books with secret clues disguised as inconsistencies. In fact, those are his favorite kind of secret clues and his favorite kinds of mysteries to construct. Well, they're among his favorites. I'm not sure how I would categorize his mysteries. There's a lot of different ideas there, but he says, when in doubt, assume error. So that's his way of dealing with these inconsistencies that he finds in the story. And in situations like this, where it's just a typo, it's going to be a good way to deal with it, because it'll save you a lot of time and mental energy thinking about what the heck's going on here. But in the cases where it's actually a real mystery, the mystery is completely inaccessible to him, because he's just going to assume every time that it's author error, or it's a typo, or it's just nothing. Let's look at another example. This thread is, what mysteries has George written do you think even he hasn't figured out yet? And turns out this is the same commenter. He says, that's not the same as, quote, every word in these books is a giant code, hinting at secret truths of the universe, which is how some people seem to interpret it. Like, quote, who is Arston Whitebeard, or, quote, who sent the cat's paw, are little puzzles. How does magic actually work is a mystery of the kind he'd said pretty explicitly will never be solved. In his first line, he's misrepresenting what people who disagree with him actually think. He's saying that they think every word in these books is a giant code, hinting at secret truths of the universe. Now, I can grant him hyperbole with secret truths of the universe. He's just being colorful there. I don't think that's the misrepresentation. Or at least that's not the one I'm interested in, even though it is obviously hyperbole is by definition a misrepresentation. No, the misrepresentation is every word in these books is a giant code, hinting at secret truths. Maybe there are some people who actually think that, but I don't think so. I haven't seen any of them. That'd be pretty wild. Somebody who thinks every use of the word the or is some kind of part of some code or something. That'd be some Da Vinci Code type of shit. They're just counting letters and whatever. Finding mathematical patterns rather than philosophical ones. But many of the words, especially the ones that are stand out, they're inconsistent with what we've seen before from the story, are in fact part of a mystery that if you pore over it long enough, you could actually conceivably solve the mystery with the information that's available in the story. Let me look at another example. This thread is called, what is the most delusional thing that is believed in the fandom? This commenter said that every legend, myth, bedtime story, or parable told by a character in the book is actually a prophecy that we're definitely going to see play out, and that every person of legend has a modern-day reincarnation just waiting to be revealed who will resolve the conflict exactly the same way they did 1,000 plus years ago. Not every tale has endgame significance. Sometimes it's just world building. Do you honestly think George R. R. Martin, an author notorious for making it up as he goes, told us 7 books in advance how it's all going to happen when he's still working that out for himself? So, as with the other comments, my reaction to this one is, well, yes and no. Not every legend, myth, bedtime story, or parable, or I would add dream, prophecy, vision, so on and so on, is actually a prophecy that we're definitely going to see play out. But in a sense, they are. Because if you can identify the philosophies that underlie all of those stories, that they all have in common, and that's guiding the writing of them, then we are actually going to see those philosophies play out in other parts of the story and in future parts of the story. Because that's what makes a good story. Because expressing philosophies consistently is what makes it a good story. And I think maybe that's another difference between theories and analysis, where the analyst is trying to find those philosophies, to puzzle out what those are, the ideas that are driving all the author's decisions with the story. Maybe specifically for the purpose of predicting the future of the story, but not necessarily. It could just be to understand it. Or I think the theorist is trying to predict the future of the story and score points, I guess. Claim the victory as the first one who predicted it, and maybe even to entertain an audience. To entertain them with ideas, or just a shared interest even. We've all read this story and we're all familiar with it, so we all share in our love of it and our knowledge of it. And it's something we can talk about and enjoy. I think maybe the fundamental thing that differentiates the theorist from the analyst is that the analyst is always operating with the understanding that metatextuality is king. That any interpretation of the story needs to have a very meaningful metatext to it. Of any part of the story, that is. In order even to simply explain that part of the story's existence. Where I think the theorists tend to underestimate the importance of metatextuality, or to just completely disregard it, or anything in between. Or metatextuality is something like what the story means for the reader, what it says about the reader, how the story is referring to the person, people, or era that's reading it, and teaching them about themselves. Or maybe more specifically, the people who it was written for. Because you could go back and read old stuff, and the metatextuality of it is going to be way more difficult to grasp, just because it wasn't written for you. It was written for people 70, 100 years ago or whatever, who had a very different set of attitudes about the world, and a different way of looking at it. So anyway, that is sort of the landscape in the audience going into this Daenerys passage that I'm about to read. Finally, I promise. So here's the prophecy I'm going to be handling. When will he be as he was? Dany demanded. When the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, said Mirri Duur. When the seas go dry and the mountains blow in the wind like leaves. When your womb quickens again and you bear a living child. Then he will return, and not before. Dany gestured at Ser Jorah and the others. Leave us. I would speak with this Maegi alone. Mormont and the Dothraki withdrew. You knew, Dany said when they were gone. She ached, inside and out, but her fury gave her strength. You knew what I was buying, and you knew the price, and yet you let me pay it. It was wrong of them to burn my temple, the heavy, flat-nosed woman said placidly. That angered the great shepherd. This was no god's work, Dany said coldly. If I look back, I am lost. You cheated me. You murdered my child within me. The stallion who mounts the world will burn no cities now. His Khalasar shall trample no nations into dust. The first argument about this prophecy, or whatever you want to call it, is whether or not it's actually a prophecy. Because there's a subgroup of readers that we just looked at who do not think it's a prophecy. They think, like Dany, that Mirri's just saying never. She's saying never in a real assholey kind of way. And on the face of things, that is what it seems like. But you want to be careful not to take everything in the story at face value. Because a story where it is safe to take everything in it at face value is a story that has no mysteries whatsoever. So that behavior is indistinguishable from treating the story as though you believe it has no mysteries for the reader to engage with whatsoever. Which should be self-evident to anybody who thinks about it for 5 seconds. But if you don't notice that treating the story that way is indistinguishable from thinking that about the story, then it might not be so obvious to you. So this prophecy, it's a big one. It's one of the big ones that the audience loves to talk about. And there's a handful of big ones. You know, there's Azor Ahai, Lightbringer and all that. And there's the Girl in Grey. Well, people don't actually talk about that one a lot, which is kind of interesting because, I noticed it when I was engaged with Girl in Grey some years ago. Everybody just kind of agrees that it's either Alice Karstark or Jane Poole. And once they think they know the answer, they don't revisit it because they know the answer. So once that happens, they're never going to find the clues that it's Arya, because in order to find them, you have to be looking for them. So let's see. When the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. In the group of readers that believe this is a prophecy, I think the most popular interpretation of that line is that the sun is the Martell guy, Quentin Martell. He was in Westeros, and then he was sent to Essos. So that's him rising in the west and setting in the east, where he meets Daenerys, and he's trying to marry her. And he dies. So a guy whose house sigil is the sun, dying, you could say is the sun setting. So that's what when the sun rises in the west and sets in the east could mean. And then it says, when the seas go dry and mountains blow in the wind like leaves. Some people think the seas going dry means the Ironborn coming on land somewhere. Maybe in Essos, maybe in Westeros. Which is actually a more sensible interpretation than you might think. Because the Ironborn being symbolized by the sea is already pretty well established in Jojen Reed's prophecy of the sea coming to Winterfell. And then Theon and the Greyjoys climb the walls of Winterfell. Just like the water did in Jojen's dream. And sack it and take it. But another interpretation is the Dothraki Sea, which is not a sea in the conventional sense. So that's kind of what makes it a cool interpretation, is that this is a sea of grass. Dany's unlikely to consider that the sea is the Dothraki Sea, because to her this is not a sentence in a story to puzzle over. This is just something somebody said to her. So she takes sea to mean body of water, basically. But the Dothraki Sea going dry could mean a number of things. It could mean that the Dothraki leave the Dothraki Sea. Maybe they go with Daenerys over to Westeros or something. Or they just push westward or eastward or wherever. And just kind of conquer those places and make them their home. Who knows what, right? But people leaving the Dothraki Sea, that's one interpretation of the sea going dry. But it's plural. It's not just one sea, it's seas. So it being the Dothraki Sea, which is not plural, kind of doesn't work in that sense. But it still kind of survives a little bit because the Dothraki Sea could be one of the seas that goes dry. It says, and the mountains blow into the wind like leaves. I think the popular interpretation is that the mountain is the character called the Mountain, Gregor Clegane. And he's going to be killed. Probably in the trial by combat that's coming up for Cersei. And then his remains will blow in the wind like leaves. I don't know. Maybe he'll be burned. And then his ashes and cinders will blow in the wind like leaves. Another interpretation is that it could be the Mother of Mountains. I like that one better because it actually goes with the sea being the Dothraki Sea and the womb being the womb of the world, which is the lake beneath the mountain. It sort of ties together the pieces of the prophecy and localizes them all to one spot. But how a mountain could blow in the wind like leaves, I don't really know. I think it probably means that it's going to erupt. I think it might be a dormant volcano, which would be pretty tragic and epic and all that. Well, because it's a freaking volcano erupting. But also because there's a sacred city at the foot of it. The Dothraki's sacred city. So it could be like a ice and fire version of Pompeii, where this city is destroyed. Either by lava or just ashes bury it. But mostly what tells me on the mountain being the Mother of Mountains is that there's a line earlier in a Game of Thrones where I think Drogo and his dude friends go up to the mountain. And it's said that only men are allowed at the top of the mountain, which is actually a trope of storytelling. And it's one that's pretty interesting to me because I don't entirely understand it. Or at least I didn't, but I think I do now. But anyway, once you say that no women are allowed at the top of the mountain, that makes me think, okay, our woman hero here is definitely going to the top of that freaking mountain at some point in this story, for some reason. If for no other reason than the reader is just itching to know what's up there. What's going on up there? What's the big secret about? It's just a mountaintop. It says, when your womb quickens again. I think that could be the womb of the world. Actually, I'm pretty sure it is. It's one of the things that, I'll get there eventually. When your womb quickens again and you bear a living child. So if this is a prophecy, it predicts or foreshadows that Dany's going to have a baby again. And this time it'll be alive. Which is pretty good news, I think. And then he will return, and not before. So once all those events come to fruition, let's say, Drogo will return, whatever that means, but not before those things happen. It'll be after. This line, then he will return and not before, is one of the reasons I know this is a prophecy. Because you find the same sorts of lines in other prophecies, where metatextually it's telling the reader, hey, this is in fact a prophecy. This is the beginning of a prophecy puzzle, if you want to play it. It basically is, it's a line that says, this stuff is definitely going to come to fruition in some interpretation. Your job is to figure out how. So you can rest assured that if you engage with this puzzle, you won't be wasting your time and it will be fun and cool and interesting when you either figure it out or you run out of time and I just tell you the answers at the end. Or show you the answers at the end. Anyway, Dany goes on to say, you knew. She accuses Mirri of knowing that the magic ritual would kill her baby. And she puts all of the blame on Mirri for letting Dany pay that price without knowing what it was. Mirri's responses are interesting because she doesn't actually try to refute anything Dany's accusing her of, but she doesn't confess to it either exactly. Like, you could interpret it as confession, sort of. Confession is one viable interpretation of her lines, but not by any means the only one. Mirri responds, "It was wrong of them to burn my temple. That angered the great shepherd." So it's a retaliatory kind of response, because it seems like she's basically giving the reason why she thinks Drogo and Rhaego and Dany all got what they deserved. If you haven't seen my video called "You Knew the Price," this is a good time to watch it. It's not very long. But after you're through with it, you'll understand that Dany actually did know that Rhaego's life was the price she would have to pay for this blood magic. Her body language reveals it, and Mirri Maz Duur saw her body language. So both Dany and Mirri know that this is not really Mirri's fault. And when she says, "You cheated me, you murdered my child within me," those lines put all of the blame onto Mirri, where most of it actually belongs to Dany. Because Dany knew she wasn't supposed to do blood magic, and she was warned not to do it, both by Mirri and the Dothraki. Then Mirri makes another response that's pretty similar in character to the first one. She says, "The stallion who mounts the world will burn no cities now. His Khalasar shall trample no nations into dust." So again, that could be interpreted as a retaliatory sort of response, where she's sort of gloating by describing how the world is a better place now, that Khal Drogo is comatose and Rhaego is dead, and Dany is, I guess, disempowered, you could say, because her husband's dead and her son is dead. But an interpretation where Mirri is not being retaliatory is still viable, and all she's really doing is saying her actual opinion on a situation that Dany's responsible for. Dany says, "I spoke for you. I saved you." And it kind of reveals how Dany saw the situation going into it. She thought that Mirri was her friend because she saved her from rape. But as Mirri points out, she'd been raped 3 times before Dany got to her. "The 4th was in me when you rode past. How then did you save me? I saw my God's house burn, where I had healed good men beyond counting. My home they burned as well, and in the street I saw piles of heads. I saw the head of a baker who made my bread. I saw the head of a boy I had saved from dead-eye fever, only 3 moons past. I heard children crying as the riders drove them off with their whips. Tell me again what you saved." "Your life." Mirri Maz Duur laughed cruelly. "Look to your call and see what life is worth when all the rest is gone." So that's yet another line where Mirri's words are straddling the interpretation between, is she being retaliatory or is she just saying her point of view? Is she being kind of neutral? And maybe even a little coldly neutral, where it's a situation where there's an expectation of her to be sympathetic, and so there's a noteworthy absence of sympathy for Dany. But considering Mirri's perspective, a lack of sympathy for Dany is pretty unnoteworthy, actually. And if you or me or anybody we know was in Mirri's situation and went through what she went through before Dany saved her, we'd probably have just as little sympathy for Dany as Mirri does. Remember, Mirri hasn't seen Dany's story. This chapter is chapter 9 of Dany's story, but for Mirri, it's chapter 1, 2, or 3. I don't know exactly. And the fact that Mirri's lines straddle the interpretation between being retaliatory or vindictive or something and being neutral is important for us to know and go over, because identifying that is what helps us solve the prophecy at the beginning. I feel like I say it in every episode, but it's so central to this story that it needs to be said all the time. A Song of Ice and Fire's fundamental challenge to the reader is to put yourself in the shoes or the skin of every single character in it, especially the ones that you think are evil, and to try to see the situation from their point of view, and to really try. So the interpretation of A Song of Ice and Fire and this prophecy and Dany and Mirri and all of it splits across that line. It splits across there are readers who are not trying to put themselves in the shoes of Mirri Maz Duur to see what's valid about her perspective, and there are readers who are. For the readers who are not, they're not going to notice that the interpretation of Mirri's lines has this consistent dualistic nature to it, where you could read it as a retaliatory reply, or you could read it as a neutral reply. And the readers who are putting themselves in Mirri's shoes are going to notice that. And so they're going to have the tools they need to apply to the prophecy in order to help them solve it. Because the same thing is going on with the prophecy. So let's look at the prophecy again, this time with more context. The paragraph or two right before it that we always leave off because it isn't part of the prophecy. Dany kissed her son and stars gently on the brow, and stood to face Mirri Maz Duur. Your spells are costly, Maiki. He lives, said Mirri Maz Duur. You asked for life. You paid for life. This is not life for one who was as Drogo was. His life was laughter, and meat roasting over a fire pit, and a horse between his legs. His life was in a rock in his hand, and his bells ringing in his hair as he rode to meet an enemy. His life was his blood riders, and me, and the son I was to give him. Mirri Maz Duur made no reply. When will he be as he was? Dany demanded. When the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, said Mirri Maz Duur. So on and so on. So if you want to stop and think about it, try to apply the tool we just extracted to those paragraphs. Now's the time to do it, because I'm gonna tell you the answer soon. Are you ready? Here we go. The most perplexing part of the prophecy for readers is how exactly Khal Drogo will return, or, to quote Dany, be as he was. He's dead. Dany killed him with a pillow. So, it's not possible. He'd have to be re-raised or something. One interpretation is that Drogo was sort of reincarnated because his soul went into Drogon. Drogon's even named for Drogo. Which is fine and cool and all, but Drogo being a dragon definitely isn't Drogo being as he was, because he wasn't a dragon before he was a human. And Drogo being Drogon isn't really Drogo returning to Dany either. So the solution to this prophecy is that Mirri Maz Duur's paragraph in this is once again straddling the interpretation between retaliatory and neutral. There are 4 paragraph breaks we need to look at. The first one is, this is not life. The second one is, Mirri Maz Duur made no reply. The third one is, when will he be as he was? And the fourth one is, the prophecy, when the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. In the prophecy, Drogo's name is never used. What Mirri said was, then he will return. When you look at the first paragraph, you can see that Dany has a lot to say. In fact, right at the end of that paragraph, Dany introduces a subject to the conversation who's not Drogo. She says, his life was his blood riders, and me, and the son I was to give him. So the cream of this mystery is that the subject of Mirri's prophecy is not actually called Drogo. It's Rhaego. Rhaego Targaryen was kidnapped at birth. He wasn't actually born dead or deformed. The Dothraki have him, and they're keeping him because he's their savior figure. He's the stallion who mounts the world. So throughout this chapter, if you reread it, you may notice that Dany's asleep for most of it. In fact, when she wakes up, they put her back to sleep with the potion or something. I think they do it 2 or 3 times. And since the chapter is written from Dany's point of view, every moment that she's asleep is an opportunity for any of the other characters to plan and execute the kidnapping of her baby. Dany gave birth while she was asleep, so she has no freaking clue what happened. She has to go on the words of Mirri, actually, which is another way I know that Rhaego was kidnapped. Because when you read what the fans have to say about the situation, something they sometimes say is that Jorah wouldn't have lied to Dany about this. But as it turns out, it wasn't Jorah who told her that the baby was born dead and deformed. In fact, when Jorah began to tell her, he stopped. Apparently he couldn't do it. Let me find that and read it. Princess, are you well? Should you be up, weak as you are? Weak? I am strong, Jorah. To please him, she reclined on a pile of cushions. Tell me how my child died. He never lived, my princess. The women say... He faltered, and Dany saw how the flesh hung loose on him, and the way he limped when he moved. Tell me what the women say. He turned his face away. His eyes were haunted. They say the child was... She waited, but Sir Jorah could not say it. His face grew dark with shame. He looked half a corpse himself. Monstrous, Mirri Duur finished for him. The knight was a powerful man, yet Dany understood in that moment that the Maiki was stronger and crueler and infinitely more dangerous. Twisted, I drew him forth myself. He was scaled like a lizard, blind, with the stub of a tail and small leather wings, like the wings of a bat. When I touched him, the flesh sloughed off the bone, and inside he was full of grave worms and the stink of corruption. He had been dead for years. Darkness, Dany thought. The terrible darkness sweeping up behind to devour her. If she looked back, she was lost. So Jorah started to tell her the lie that the baby was born a monster. He couldn't do it. Mirri saw that he couldn't do it, so she did it for him. She picked it up. Now, I don't know the details of the kidnapping. I don't know who's all in on it. Obviously, Jorah and Mirri are in on it, at the least. And probably the handmaids, too. But there it is. Rhaego's alive. He will return. I'm excited for it. And if you look at the prophecy, you can kind of see how that scene is going to happen. Or it says when your womb quickens again and you bear a living child, then he will return, and not before. From Mirri's perspective, Dany is Dothraki. Even though from our perspective, she's not. She's married to a Dothraki man. She's basically the queen of this Dothraki horde, which happens to be the biggest Dothraki horde. And so Dany's Dothraki from Mirri's point of view. So when she says, when your womb quickens again, the womb of the world qualifies as Dany's womb. And when she says, and you bear a living child, we assume bear means birth, but another interpretation of bear is to just hold. So that's how Dany's going to bear Rhaego. I think Rhaego is going to be handed to her. I think somebody's going to carry Rhaego out of the lake, the womb of the world, then walk up to Dany and hand him over. And I think that scene is actually in one of her dreams somewhere. Well, I know it is. I just don't remember which dream it is. But yeah, she has a vision of somebody walking out of the lake towards her. I think it's a woman. And it's a scene that's impossible to place otherwise, because nothing like that has been seen yet by Dany. Or even by us. I don't think there's a scene like that anywhere in the series yet. Maybe Septo Lemore is like the closest thing off the top of my head. Anyway, another way I know that Rhaego is alive is through the House of the Undying visions. Davos and Stannis have a debate about prophecies, where they're sort of arguing about how should we handle prophecies. They're having the prophecy debate of, do they depict things that happen in the past or that are going to happen in the future? And how do you know when it's doing one or the other, if it does both? And how should we handle them? Like, should we just ignore them because they're going to come true anyway? Or should we, if they're undesirable, should we try to prevent them? Or can we even? Like, if we tried to prevent it, would it just come true anyway in some way we don't expect? They're not going into that much depth as I am now about it. But the comments they are making are allude to those questions. Stannis actually has the right of it at the end. Where Stannis' sentiment is, the question of whether we engage with it or not is sort of beside the point. The point is that it's going to come true. The visions are true in some interpretation, and you doubt that at your peril. And so that's the same way the prophecies work in the story, where there's a section of readers who doubt that the sun rises in the west and sets in the east prophecy is in fact a prophecy, and that is going to come true in some interpretation. There's a section of readers who think it's a prophecy and are trying to actually solve it and treat the story like it's a piece of literature. It's made of nothing but words. And if it has puzzles in it, which it obviously does, they're going to be puzzles about and made of words. And just the structure of the text. And that's what's going on with this prophecy. It's a subject switcheroo. Mirri's responding to the subject of Rhaego instead of Drogo. Rhaego's alive. Anyway, this was fun. I gotta go. Thanks for hanging out, guys. I'll see you next time.